7 warships hung in the dark
I see
above a
him, my
green
child.
world, silent,
I mean no harm, Your
patient,
Majesty.
the
State
way
your purpose,
predators
warrior.
wait when they already know the outcome.
Please listen.
Below, inside the palace, deep beneath the stone and the roots and the breathing walls, a man stood alone in a cathedral that had not been entered in 300 years. Blue light pulsed around him, slow, ancient, like a heartbeat that had never stopped. In his closed fist, a small pendant glowed, not reflecting, generating, something alive in the crystal that had no name in any human language. Above him, 7 ships powered their cannons. The countdown had started, and somewhere between the warships and the deep dark, in a room that smelled like moon blossoms and old paper, a 7-year-old girl sat perfectly still, waiting. She was not afraid. She had done the math. She knew he would come back. She had always known. Part 1. The man who didn't leave the pendant was warm. That was the first thing Caden Voss noticed when Empress Vraylin pressed it into his palm. Not heavy, not cold, warm, like it had been waiting in a closed fist for years and had finally been allowed to breathe. He didn't know what it meant yet. He would. 8 months earlier, Caden Voss arrived on Zara with 30 pounds of gear, a sealed transfer order, and absolutely no illusions about why he was there. Exile. That was the honest word for it. The coalition called it a cultural liaison assignment, part of the post-war trust initiative, a chance to serve in a meaningful capacity during a sensitive diplomatic period. Right. He was a problem they couldn't shoot and couldn't ignore, so they shipped him somewhere quiet and hoped he'd stay that way. He stepped off the transport onto the landing platform of Verdant Spire and stopped. He'd read the briefings, seen the photographs. None of it prepared him for the actual color of Zara's sky at dusk. Not blue, not purple, something between the two that didn't have a human name. The palace rose ahead of him, like something grown rather than built. Towers of pale stone, wrapped in bioluminescent vines, living architecture, breathing walls, the kind of place that made a man feel like an error in the code. A guard met him at the gate, short, professional, green-skinned, white-haired eyes that slid over Caden like he was furniture. Sergeant Voss. Just Voss, Caden said. Not a sergeant anymore. The guard didn't respond to that, just turned and walked. Caden followed. That was how it started. Not with ceremony, not with welcome, just a man carrying his bag through corridors that didn't belong to him, trying not to stare at the walls that pulsed faintly with light, like something alive underneath the stone. He was assigned a room in the outer guard barracks, small, clean, a window that looked out over the eastern garden. He set his bag on the floor, sat on the edge of the cot, and stared at the ceiling. 14 months ago, he'd filed a report. 14 months ago, he'd written down exactly what happened at Cyrus 7. The evacuation warnings that went unheeded, the civilian convoy that didn't make it out, the orders that came from above, the names, the timestamps, all of it. Precise, documented, the kind of report that either ends careers or ends the man who wrote it. His unit was dissolved 3 weeks later. His transfer order arrived the week after that. He wasn't surprised. He was tired. There's a difference. The first week at Verdant Spire, Caden did his job and nothing else. Morning drills, perimeter checks, protocol briefings he didn't need because he'd been a soldier for 15 years and knew how to stand in a room without touching anything. The Zari guards watched him, the way people watch a dog that hasn't bitten anyone yet. Cautious, waiting. He didn't give them anything to wait for. He ate alone, slept early, kept his boots clean, and every evening after the second patrol, he walked through the eastern garden because it was quiet and it smelled like something he couldn't name. Not earth, not any earth smell he remembered. Something older, like rain on stone that had never been touched by anything man-made. That was where he first saw her, not the first evening, the second. He almost didn't notice. She was small enough that in the dark against the base of the moon willow tree, she looked like a shadow that had decided to sit down. He was halfway past her when something stopped him. Sound. Not crying, not quite. The almost crying that happens when a person has been doing it so long they've run out of the loud part, and all that's left is the breath. Short, uneven, swallowed before it could become anything. He stopped. He looked. A child, 7 years old maybe, green skin pale in the moonlight, white hair in braids that had come half undone. A small, six-legged creature curled in her lap, fur iridescent as an oil slick, watching Caden with eyes like copper coins. The child didn't look up. Caden didn't say anything. He stood there for a moment, long enough to feel awkward, long enough to think, this isn't my business, and also I should leave, and also she's been out here alone for a while. He left. That night he lay on his cot and told himself it wasn't his problem. The third evening she was there again. Same spot, same tree. The small creature Tizzy, he would learn later, was perched on her knee this time, chittering softly at something in the dark. The child was talking back to it in Zari, low, rhythmic, the way people talk when they're not really talking to the creature but to the empty air and need something warm to direct it at. Caden stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the path back to the barracks. He sat down on the ground about 3 feet away from her. Not close, not far, just there. She went quiet. Tizzy swiveled its head to look at him. The creature seemed to be conducting some kind of evaluation. Then it chittered once and went back to watching the moths. The child looked at him sideways, suspicious, the way children look at adults who are being weird without being obviously threatening. "You're the human," she said, in common tongue, accented but clear. "Yeah, you smell like metal. Probably. I cleaned my gear today." She considered this, decided it was an acceptable explanation, looked away. They sat in silence for a while. The twin moons were rising. The vines on the palace wall glowed faintly. Somewhere in the middle distance, a night bird made a sound like a question with no answer. Then she said, "Are you going to leave too?" Just like that. No build-up. Like the question had been sitting on her tongue all night, and she'd finally decided the silence wasn't doing anything useful. Caden looked at her. He didn't know anything about her. He didn't know she was the princess. He didn't know her name. He didn't know that 4 years ago she'd lost her father to a shuttle accident, and that nobody in the palace had quite figured out how to sit with her since. He didn't know that the portrait she'd mentioned, the one in the Hall of Echoes, was the only image of Aiden she could still find that looked like him when he was laughing. He didn't know any of that yet, so he didn't answer the question with words. He just didn't stand up. They sat under the moon willow until she fell asleep against the roots of the tree, Tizzy curled on her chest like a small warm coal. Caden carried her back to the royal wing, walked past 3 startled attendants, ignored the protocol about humans in royal quarters, set her down on the bed, tucked the blanket up to her chin, walked back to the barracks, lay down on his cot, stared at the ceiling. Didn't think anything in particular, just stayed with the strange, specific weight of having been somewhere that mattered. 8 months is a long time when you're not counting. He wasn't counting. That's how he knew it was real. The nights under the moon willow became a habit before either of them decided to make it one. Suri, that was her name. He learned it on the 4th night when she introduced herself with the formal Zari greeting. Both hands pressed together, head bowed, and then immediately ruined the formality by asking if he could do it back, even though he probably didn't know how. He didn't. He tried anyway. She laughed. That was the first time. He taught her to tie knots, sailor's knots specifically, which was a strange thing to teach a child on a planet without oceans. But she'd asked what his hands could do that hers couldn't, and that was the first honest answer he had. She learned the bow line in 15 minutes, the figure 8 in 20. She got the cleat hitch wrong 4 times and blamed the rope. She taught him Zari's script. She was a terrible teacher, impatient, fond of declaring that he was pronouncing everything wrong while refusing to demonstrate the correct pronunciation. He managed to learn 37 characters before he realized she'd been making up the names for half of them and laughing about it privately for weeks. He didn't correct her. He started making up names back. She found this unacceptably delightful. The soup started in month 2. She woke up from a nightmare, something she wouldn't describe, just shook her head hard when he asked, and sat at the small table in the guard antechamber, looking like a person who has been wrung out and hung to dry. He didn't have anything useful to say. He made soup instead. Too much salt, wrong proportion of everything, the kind of soup a soldier makes from ration packs, and optimism. She drank the whole bowl. "It's terrible," she said. "I know. Can you make it again tomorrow?" He did. He didn't think of himself as her father. He was very clear about this in the private accounting he did with himself on the long afternoons between patrols. He was not her father. He was a guard. He was a man who sat with a child who needed someone to sit with her. That was all. Except that he checked her window from the courtyard every night before he slept, just to make sure the light was off. Except that when he heard her cough in the corridor, he stopped walking. Except that when Chancellor Drev, the silver-streaked noble who looked at Caden like something tracked in on a boot, made a remark at a state function about the inappropriate familiarity between palace staff and the royal child, Caden had to make a very deliberate decision to keep his hands at his sides. He wasn't her father, but some part of him had stopped asking the question. The summons came on a Tuesday, or what passed for Tuesday on Zara, the 4th day of the 2nd-week cycle, which Suri had decided was called Tuesday because Caden had mentioned it was his least favorite day, and she wanted to understand why. He was called to the throne room. Full court. He knew what that meant. He'd been in enough command structures to know that public settings mean public messages. Someone wanted this on record. Someone wanted witnesses. He walked in with his boots clean and his back straight, and his face arranged in the expression he'd learned at 17 when he first enlisted: neutral, attentive, impossible to rattle. The throne room of Verdant Spire was extraordinary, even by the standards of a planet that had made an art form of extraordinary. The ceiling was glass, and the sky above it was that particular color again, the blue-purple that didn't have a name. Bioluminescent vines, twisted up pillars of pale stone. The jade floor reflected everything. Sound moved strangely in here, absorbed in some places, amplified in others, so that a whisper in the wrong spot could carry. The court was arranged in a crescent, nobles in ceremonial green, advisors in white, guards at the walls, and in the center at the base of the dais, already watching him walk, in Admiral Cormine. Caden's stride didn't change, his face didn't change, but something behind his sternum went very still. Corman was 55 years old, built like a man who had made a study of being immovable, gray hair close-cropped, eyes the color of old ice, a face that had stopped expressing surprise somewhere around his 35th year and never bothered starting again. He was in dress uniform, Earth Coalition gold and black, wearing it in the Zari throne room like he'd been invited. He was here as a diplomatic guest. 2 weeks of courtesy talks. That was what the briefing had said. Caden had noted it, filed it away, thought timing, because here was the thing about Admiral Cormain. Here was the thing Caden knew and had written in a report that subsequently vanished 14 months ago at Syra 7. The evacuation order had a signature at the bottom. One signature, one name. He hadn't seen the Admiral in 14 months, and now they were in the same room. The Empress descended. Caden had seen Vraylin at a distance before, at the welcoming ceremony when he first arrived, at the perimeter review 2 months in, always at a distance, always with the full formal buffer zone of rank and occasion between them. Up close, she was something else entirely. Tall, regal in a way that wasn't performed, just structural, like she'd been built that way and had never thought about it. Her skin was the deep green of old malachite, the kind that catches light and holds it rather than reflecting it back. Her hair, platinum, shot through with threads of deep violet, was coiled high, threaded with mourning beads that shifted color as she moved. Her eyes were amber, vertical pupils, eyes that didn't miss things. She was not looking at Caden the way she would look at furniture. She was looking at him the way a surgeon looks at a problem before deciding where to cut. She stopped 3 steps from him. The court went quiet. Corman had shifted to stand at the edge of Caden's peripheral vision. "Why?" the Empress said. Her voice was low. It didn't need volume. The room carried it perfectly to every corner. "Does my daughter call you father?" Not a question. The inflection was all wrong for a question. This was an accounting. She wanted a number, and she wanted it accurate. Caden opened his mouth, and from the side archway, bare feet slapping the jade floor at a dead sprint, Suri arrived. She skidded to a halt, looked at the scene, read it in approximately 1 second with the accuracy of a 7-year-old who had grown up in a room full of adults who talked around her instead of to her. She walked to Caden and wrapped both arms around his leg, looked up at her mother. "Because he is my father," she announced, with absolute conviction, with the tone of someone explaining that water was wet. "He makes soup when I have nightmares. He showed me knots. He doesn't leave." Vraylin's jaw tightened. "He is a guard," she said, each word deliberate. "Assigned to palace security. He is not." "Then who is?" Suri said, and her voice was small and clear, and it went straight through everything like a wire through water. The portrait in the hall doesn't hug back. Silence. The kind of silence that happens when a room full of people realizes something true has just been said out loud, possibly for the first time. Caden felt it hit Vraylin. Not because she showed it, she was too well trained for that, but her stillness changed quality, became the stillness that happens when a person absorbs a blow they weren't expecting. And then, from the edge of his peripheral vision, Corman spoke. How extraordinary. His voice was dry, measured, carrying just enough warmth to feel like mockery to anyone paying attention. A disgraced grunt from a dissolved unit, playing father to an empress's child. A pause. How desperate must a broken man be? The words landed the way they were designed to, in public, in front of witnesses, a statement too civil to be called an attack and too precise to be called anything else. The court didn't move. Caden looked at Corman. He didn't say anything. That was a choice, the hardest one he'd made in this room, because what he wanted to say was, "I know what you did at Cyrus 7. I know why you're here. I know exactly what a broken man looks like because I watched you build the conditions for it and then sign your name to the results." He said none of that. He looked at the Empress instead. "I have no idea why she calls me that," he said, voice steady. "I just stayed when she asked me to, that's all." Vraylin studied him, amber eyes moving over his face like she was reading text in a language she hadn't expected to find there, looking for ambition, looking for the angle, looking for whatever a man in his position would want from proximity to a royal child. Whatever she found or didn't find, she didn't say. She turned to the court. Straight spine, composed, return to your duties. The court dissolved. Corman offered a small correct bow and moved away with the unhurried pace of a man who has accomplished what he came to accomplish. Suri had not let go of Caden's leg. Vraylin looked at her daughter. Something moved through her expression, not cold, not warm, the face of a person managing something large in a space too small for it. "Go with your attendants," she said, quietly. "We'll speak later." Suri looked up at Caden. He gave the smallest nod. She let go of his leg, squared her small shoulders, walked away with Tizzy chittering from her pocket, casting one last look back at him from the archway. Then she was gone, and it was just him and the Empress in the enormous, empty, light-fractured room. "Sergeant Voss," Vraylin said. "Just Voss, Your Majesty." A pause. "You are dismissed," she said. He went. The attack came at dusk. 23 days after the throne room, 17 days after he'd learned from a sealed transfer update that arrived in his personal message queue that Admiral Corman's diplomatic visit had been quietly extended for another 2 weeks, Caden was on the 2nd Perimeter Patrol, Eastern Wing, the part of the route that ran along the outer garden wall, close enough to the moon willow that he could smell it when the wind came from the south. The alarm went off at 1742, not the gradual alert that meant sensor anomaly or system test. The 3-beat pulse that meant breach, actual breach, someone inside the perimeter who wasn't supposed to be. He was running before the second pulse finished. The Ashbourne faction. He'd read the intelligence reports, splinter group, post-war hardliners who believed the peace accords were a capitulation rather than a compromise, who believed the Zari bloodline had been contaminated by association with humanity and needed to be their word cleansed. They'd been classified as a low-priority threat 2 months ago. Someone had miscalculated. They came through the eastern wall in a shower of jade and smoke, 7 of them, ash-gray armor, white hair bound in warrior knots, moving with the efficiency of people who had planned this exact route in advance and practiced it until it was reflex. Their leader was broad and scarred, cybernetic eye, glowing dull red in the smoke plasma axe, humming a sound almost too low to hear. Almost. He was headed for the royal wing. Caden cut across the courtyard at an angle, not toward the leader, toward the door behind the leader, because the Empress would be coming from the throne room, the protocol route, the one they'd all been briefed on, and the Ashbourne were going to meet her in the corridor. He reached the door at the same moment she came through it. Vraylin, in full battle configuration armor, beneath the ceremonial robes, energy whip already drawn and charged. She moved like she'd done this before, which she had. He knew that from the briefings. She'd led her people through 2 prior conflicts. She was not a ceremonial queen. She was also outnumbered. The corridor filled with bodies. Caden's pulse blade, short, outdated, Earth manufacture. The only weapon he'd been permitted to keep under the diplomatic protocols was in his hand before he consciously decided to draw it. He went left. Vraylin went right. No discussion, no signal, just the immediate geometry of trained combatants reading the same space. He was not the strongest person in that corridor. He was very fast. Years of close quarters training in environments where fast was the difference between going home and not going home. The Ashbourne moved like soldiers. He moved like someone who had spent a decade fighting in places where the walls were 3 feet apart, and the person on the other side of the next corner might or might not be a threat, and he had about half a second to figure out which. Ducking, flanking, using the pillars, drawing fire away from the Empress's position, buying seconds. And then he heard Suri, not screaming. That would have been easier to manage somehow. Just a voice, small, from the end of the corridor where she'd come looking for him, because of course she had, because she'd heard the alarm and done the math about where he'd be. She had a ceremonial dagger in her hand, too big, trembling, pointed at the raider who'd just noticed her. "Don't you touch him," she said. The raider laughed, reaching for her. Caden threw his pulse blade, not the calculated optimal throw, the only throw available, spinning end over end across 30 feet of smoke-filled corridor and burying itself in the raider's shoulder. The raider went down. Caden sprinted, reached Suri, got his body between her and the next threat. The axe leader was 3 steps away. Behind him, Vraylin's whip cracked twice, and Ashbourne went down, but she was being pressed back toward the vault entrance. 2 of them on her now. "Take her," Vraylin called across the smoke. Not a request, not a question, a transfer of the thing she valued most to the person she had no rational basis for trusting. Caden grabbed Suri's hand. "The bunker," he said. "Now." "But Mom, she can handle 2. She can't handle 2 and watch you at the same time." "Move." Suri moved. He knew the service corridors better than most of the palace staff because he'd made a project of learning them in month 3 when it had become clear that not knowing your exit routes was the kind of mistake you only made once. They ran. Suri ran without being told twice. She was fast for her size. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She held Tizzy against her chest with one hand and ran. The azure garden, moon willow at the center, silver leaves catching the emergency lights. He found the hatch beneath the roots, hidden solid, the kind of thing that doesn't advertise itself. Pried it open, dropped her down first. There are rations, he said. Water, a comm unit. You seal it from the inside. Caden, Suri. He waited until she looked at him. Not through him, not at the smoke behind him. At him. Seal it. Promise. She looked at him for a long moment with those silver eyes that were too old for her face. Come back, she said. Not a request either. He went. The vault corridor was the worst of it. He found Raylan there, her whip spent the crystal core, burned through 2 Ashborn between her and the vault door. The leader was there too, plasma axe raised. The unhurried posture of someone who knows the math has already been done, and they've already won. You cling to power, the leader said, like a child to a blanket. Your line ends here, tainted by alien weakness. Caden shot him, not from close range, from the corner from 40 feet away with a guard's rifle he'd pulled from an alcove 2 corridors back. The plasma bolt hit center mass. The leader went down. The other 2 turned. Caden didn't wait for their decision. He moved through the smoke, one down from a strike to the knee joint, the specific vulnerability in Ashborn armor that the intelligence reports had mentioned and he'd memorized because that was the kind of person he was. The second went for Vraelin and found her already moving her spent whip turned into a weighted weapon, the crystal housing catching the second one across the temple. It was over. Vraelin was breathing hard, robes torn, a cut above her eye bleeding green. She looked at him, standing there in the wreckage of her corridor, rifle in hand, smoke behind him. You came back, she said. Suri's in the bunker, he said. She's fine. She sealed it. A pause. My kid's waiting. Not the princess, not your daughter, not the royal heir. My kid. It hung in the air between them. Vraelin looked at him, the look that goes past the face to whatever's running the operation underneath. And whatever she found there, she didn't correct him. Later, much later, when the Ashborn had been routed and the fires contained and the damage tallied, when Suri had been retrieved from the bunker and had immediately cataloged every scratch on Caden's arms and hands with the focused disapproval of someone who had strong opinions about unnecessary damage to things she cared about. When the palace staff had stopped running and started the quieter work of accounting for what was broken, the Empress called for him, not to the throne room this time, a smaller room, a private audience chamber, candles rather than ceiling lights, the twin moons visible through a high window. She was standing when he came in, still in the torn robes. She hadn't changed. He noticed that. In her hand was a pendant, small, a leaf of moon willow carved from star crystal, threaded on a chain of braided silver. He'd seen it in the briefings, one of the historical artifacts, part of the royal collection. He'd also seen it in a portrait. Around the throat of the man in the portrait in the Hall of Echoes, he stopped himself. Aten, the late prince consort, dead 4 years. On Zara, she said. Her voice was different in small rooms, less architecture, more just voice. We do not give titles lightly. Father, mother, these are not roles assumed, they are earned. A pause. Through presence, through sacrifice, through love that does not know how to ask for return. He said nothing. My daughter has not called anyone father since Aten died. She turned the pendant in her fingers. Not her tutors, not her advisors, not the council regents who spent 3 years trying to fill the shape of something they didn't understand. She looked up. You did not seek this. No, he said. You did not scheme. You did not make yourself useful in order to make yourself necessary. No, you simply stayed. Yes, she stepped forward, held out the pendant. This belonged to Aten. It is given only to those who are family. He looked at it, small, moon pale, carved with a precision that spoke of time and intention. I'm just a guard, he said, and he meant it. Not false modesty, just the flat geography of what he believed himself to be. You are Suri's father, Fraylin said, and there was no question in her voice, no interrogation, no searching, just the quality of a woman stating a thing she has already decided is true. He took the pendant. It was warm in his palm, warmer than it should have been, and then as his fingers closed around it, it began to glow. Not bright, not dramatic, a quiet, steady blue light, steady as a heartbeat. Vraylin went very still. From the doorway, Suri made a small sound. She'd been standing there. She was 7 years old, and she hadn't left his field of vision voluntarily since the bunker, and she was looking at the pendant with an expression that was part wonder and part something else. Recognition, maybe, like she'd seen this before, or read about it. Outside through the high window, the twin moons rose together over the verdant spire, and, somewhere beneath their feet, deep in the geothermal dark, something old and vast and patient felt the light, and began very slowly to wake. Part 2. What the war buried. 3 weeks after the Ashbourne attack, the palace smelled like fresh plaster and cut stone. Reconstruction. Every morning, Caden woke to the sound of it, hammers and Zari tools that hummed rather than struck. Workers moving through the eastern corridor with the focus of people who understand that fixing a wall is also fixing something else, something you can't name but can feel in the way the air sits differently in a room that has been hurt and is now being made whole again. He understood the impulse. He'd been doing a version of it himself for 8 months. The pendant lived inside his shirt now, against his skin, not because anyone told him to keep it there, just because that was where it ended up the first morning, and moving, it felt like a decision he hadn't been asked to make yet. He didn't think about what that meant. Not yet. Suri found him at breakfast on the 4th day after the attack. She sat down across from him at the small table in the guard antechamber, her table, technically since she'd started appearing at it so regularly that the kitchen staff had started sending 2 portions, and she was carrying something. A book. Old. Genuinely old. The kind of old that has a smell, deep paper and something mineral underneath it. The cover was Zari script in a style he'd learned to recognize as archaic. Letters that had been retired from common use a generation back. "Whose is that?" he said. "Grandma's." She set it on the table between them, opened it to a page marked with a dried moon willow leaf. "I found it when they were clearing the damaged storage room in the East Archive. It was in a box behind a wall panel." She looked at him. "A hidden wall panel." "Okay." Grandma hid a journal behind a wall panel. People hide things. Important things. She tapped the page. "I've been translating it." He looked at her. 7 years old, teaching herself to decode archaic script from a hidden journal she found behind a panel that wasn't supposed to exist. "Of course you have," he said. She accepted this as the compliment it was. He didn't read the journal that day. He noted it, filed it away in the part of his mind that collected details, and waited to understand them later. The part of his mind that had spent 14 months knowing that a report had disappeared and a fleet admiral was walking free, and eventually those 2 facts were going to find each other in a room, and he needed to be ready when they did, because Corman was still here. 2 weeks had become 4. The diplomatic visit that had no visible diplomatic agenda kept extending, kept finding new reasons to stay. Corman moved through the palace with the ease of a man who believed every room was eventually going to be his. He was courteous, correct, said all the right things in all the right tones. He watched Caden the way a patient man watches a problem he hasn't solved yet. Caden watched him back. The afternoons belonged to Suri now. Officially, she had tutors, instructors in history and language and the diplomatic protocols she would one day need to know, the way a surgeon needs to know anatomy, not academically, but in the hands, instinctive, reflex, deep. She went to her lessons. She was good at them. But afternoons she found him. The courtyard near the eastern wall where he ran maintenance drills with the other guards. She would perch on a low wall and watch Tizzy on her knee until the drill was over. Then she would walk beside him on the cool-down lap and talk about whatever was in her head that day, which could be anything from the structural properties of Zari architecture to a philosophical question she developed about whether it was ethical to name a pet after someone you liked, because wasn't that a form of ownership, and wasn't ownership complicated? He had learned to respond to these without breaking stride. The Zari script lessons happened in the evenings at the small table. He was still terrible. His pronunciation made her wince in a way she tried to hide and then stopped trying to hide because it was more honest. He kept getting better in small increments that she measured and announced without sentiment. You got the third character right 4 times today. Not praise exactly, just accounting. He appreciated the precision of it. She was teaching him. He was teaching her. Knots, stars, the names of things, the way 2 people build a language between them that nobody else speaks. He didn't think about what that was. He just let it be what it was. And then there was Vraylin. He hadn't let himself think about Vraylin, which was fine, reasonable. She was the empress of a sovereign world. He was a guard with a sealed file and a borrowed pendant. The distance between those 2 things was not metaphorical, except that she had started appearing in the courtyard during the afternoon drills, not to watch him. Obviously not to watch him. She had things to observe: the reconstruction progress, the positioning of the rebuilt eastern defenses, official concerns, valid concerns. She stood on the high balcony with Chancellor Drev at her shoulder and looked at the work, and Caden looked at the work too, and occasionally, in the way that people who are carefully not looking at each other still manage to have a conversation, they were aware of each other. He noticed small things, the way she tilted her head when she was listening to something she didn't fully believe, the way her posture changed between her public self and the moments when she didn't know she was being observed, a slight settling, like a person putting down a weight they carry so constantly they've forgotten it's there. He noticed that she watched Suri differently now, not less carefully, not less intently, but with something added to the watchfulness, something that looked, if he was honest, if he allowed himself a word for it, like relief, like a woman who has been standing guard over something alone for a very long time and has finally cautiously, with conditions with her hand still on the gate, let someone stand beside her. He didn't say anything about this to anyone, including himself. The file came on a Monday, or whatever Zara called Monday, the 7th day of the 3rd week cycle, which Suri had recently declared was called Monday because Caden had explained the concept of least favorite days, and she decided to make the 7th one universally mandatory for difficult things. Prophetic as it turned out. The message arrived in his personal queue at 0417, flagged routine, encoded in a cipher. He recognized the old unit cipher, the one his dissolved squad had used for personal communications in the field, the kind of code that was functionally invisible unless you already knew it existed. From no listed sender, the body of the message was 8 words. Check the attach, then decide what to do. The attachment was large: documents, transmission logs, a chain of orders that went up and ended at the top with a signature he recognized: Cormine, AR, Fleet Admiral, Earth Coalition Defense Division, authorization code classified, date 14 months ago, subject Cyrus 7, elimination of witness infrastructure. Caden sat with it for a long time. He'd known, of course he'd known. He'd written the report that named the problem. He'd watched the report disappear. He'd drawn the only conclusion available. But knowing and reading are different things, because the file didn't just contain the order. It contained a notation, a personal notation added in Cormine's own hand, separate from the official documentation. The kind of thing you add when you're not writing for the record, when you're writing for yourself, in the middle of the night, when the story you've been telling yourself starts to crack. It said, Piers was on that convoy. 4 words. Piers, Cormine's son, Lieutenant Piers Cormine, 26 years old, assigned to the Syra 7 perimeter. Caden had known his name from the casualty lists, hadn't known the relationship. The coalition had kept that quiet for obvious reasons. The notation continued, uneven, the handwriting of a man writing quickly in the dark without editing. Piers was on that convoy, and I gave the order to hold the evacuation. I gave it because command said we needed eyes on the ground for another 6 hours, and I signed it, and Piers followed orders, the way I raised him to follow orders, and he is gone, and the report says it was the Zari, but I know what the report says because I wrote it, and I know what happened because I was there, and if I let Voss file his testimony, there is no version of this where I am not the reason my son is dead. Caden sat with those words for a long time. The pale pre-dawn light of Zara crept through his window. The reconstruction crews were starting. Somewhere down the corridor he could hear the specific sound of Tizzy's morning chitter, which meant Suri was already awake. He thought about Cormine, the way the man moved through rooms, the weight behind those ice-colored eyes, the posture of a person who is holding something so large and so heavy that their entire bearing has reorganized itself around the load. He knew that posture. He'd seen it in mirrors, and then he thought Cormine came here, to Zara, to the place where his son died, in the context of a war involving the Zari. He extended his visit. He stayed. Why? Why would a man who has buried a thing this deep come to the place where it's buried and stand on top of it? Caden didn't have an answer yet, but he noted the question. The fleet appeared at 0933, 7 ships, human design, Earth Coalition markings, dropping out of FTL in a formation that was not hostile. Technically, in the way that a fist held at your shoulder height is technically not a punch. The palace's defense grid lit up automatically. Green energy fields hummed to life around the upper atmosphere. Zari satellites rotated into position. The alarm that sounded was not the 3-beat breach alarm. It was the 2-beat alert, threat detected, not yet engaged, waiting. Caden was in the corridor outside the war room when the broadcast came. He heard it through the speaker panels. The whole palace heard it. Corman's voice, stripped of the diplomatic warmth, just the command voice, the one that had been giving orders since before Caden enlisted. Zeri Dominion, this is Admiral Corman of the Earth Coalition Defense Fleet. You are currently harboring a war criminal within your palace walls. Sergeant Caden Voss, designated war criminal under Interstellar Protocol 7, is responsible for the massacre of Zari civilians at Syra 14 months ago. Pause. Surrender Caden Voss within 6 hours, or we will consider your world in violation of the Non-Harbrance Accord and act accordingly. The broadcast ended. The corridor was very quiet. Caden stood in it and felt the sensation of a trap closing, not around his wrists, around something larger, around Suri, around 8 months of soup and knots and a child who waited for him at the end of every day. Chancellor Drev's voice from the war room. Your Majesty, I recommend we convene an emergency council immediately. And Vraylin's voice, quiet, controlled. Yes, the council room was cold, not temperature, the cold that comes from a room full of people who are all doing arithmetic and not liking their answers. Vraylin sat at the head of the table. Caden stood to the side. Not at the table, he hadn't been invited to the table, and he hadn't asked. He stood where guards stand. Peripheral, present. Drev was already building his case before everyone was seated. The coalition fleet is authorized under the Non-Harbrance Accord, he said. Smooth, prepared, the voice of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Resistance would constitute an act of war, with the reconstruction barely begun, with our defense grid at 60%. He paused for effect. One man is not worth a war, Your Majesty. Vraylin said nothing. The human has brought this situation to our gates, Drev continued, each word finding its mark. Whatever the truth of his past, the political reality is simple. We surrender him. The fleet withdraws. The Dominion remains intact. The other council members were doing the arithmetic. Caden could see it. The careful, practical faces of people who understood leverage and were being asked to use it. He looked at Vraylin. She hadn't looked at him yet. She was looking at the tactical display above the table. 7 markers. The fleet. Patient. Waiting. What do you say? Drev asked. The question was addressed to Vraylin, but aimed at Caden, a man sharpening a blade in someone else's direction. Vraylin turned her head and looked at Caden, not at the accusation, not at the fleet, at him, at his face, the face of a man who has heard himself called a war criminal in a room full of people who are calculating whether it's cheaper to believe it. The file, he said quietly, not to the room, to her. I have a file. Everything Cormine did, the order, his own notes, the real record of Cyrus 7. He paused. If I can access it, if I can get it verified, the accusation collapses. You have 6 hours, Drev said. I know. We have 6 hours to prevent a war. I know. Drev looked at Vraylin. Your Majesty, the practical choice is clear. Vraylin's amber eyes were still on Caden. He didn't beg, didn't explain, didn't build a case, just looked back at her. The same way he'd looked at Suri that third night under the moon willow, not asking, not demanding, just present, letting the question be what it was. Leave us, Vraylin said. Drev's composure flickered. Your Majesty, the council needs to— Leave us, she said again, and this time the room heard what lived underneath the quiet. The council members stood, filed out, Drev last and slowest, with the deliberate pace of a man making a point about his reluctance. The door closed. Tell me, she said. So he did. Not the official version, the actual version. Cyrus 7. The convoy, the evacuation order that came 3 minutes too late. The report he filed, the report that vanished, the unit dissolution, the transfer order that was exile dressed as opportunity, and Piers. He told her about Piers too, about what the file contained, about the notation in Cormine's own hand, about a man who had signed an order that killed his own son and had been running from that truth ever since. Vraylin listened without moving. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Why did he come here? She said. I've been trying to understand that. A man who has buried a thing does not return to the grave unless— She stopped, started again, unless he is trying to decide whether to dig it up. Caden looked at her. She was looking at the window now, the fleet visible as distant points of light at the edge of the atmosphere. My husband did not die in an accident, she said, flatly. The flat that happens when a person has been carrying a sentence for years and has finally decided to say it out loud just to see if it survives the air. I have never been able to prove it. The investigation was conducted by coalition liaisons. The findings were— a pause. Neat. Caden said nothing. 18 was returning from peace talks. He had reached an agreement with the human delegation that would have significantly reduced coalition access to Zara's geothermal resources, including the deposits where the Hearthstone Formation was believed to be located. She turned from the window. The shuttle experienced an unexplained systems failure. Caden thought about Cormine, about geothermal resources, about a man who had been at Cyrus 7 and was now in a palace on Zara with no visible reason for the extension of his visit. Shade, he said, and then stopped, because he'd used her name, not her title. She looked at him. Your Majesty, he corrected. She held his gaze for 1 beat. 2. Caden, she said, and it was the first time she'd used his first name, and it landed the way first names do when someone who has been keeping you at title distance finally steps across the line. I believe you. That is not sufficient to stop a war with 6 hours on the clock. I know. Drev will push for surrender at the next council session. I know, and he may be right, she said, not cruelly, just precisely. Strategically, 1 man is not worth a war, he finished. I've heard. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said something he didn't expect. Suri would disagree. He had nothing to say to that, so he said nothing. He found the journal in his room that evening. Suri had left it on his cot, open, bookmarked with a clean strip of paper on which she'd written in her still wobbly Zari script a single sentence of translation. Grandma said the stone heart doesn't obey rulers, it obeys fathers. He sat on the edge of the cot and read. The Journal of Empress Zariva, Raylan's mother, written 40 years ago in archaic Zari script in the compressed shorthand of a woman who wrote quickly and privately. It took him time to work through. He used everything Suri had taught him, plus the translation notes she tucked between the pages at the relevant sections, because Suri had been reading ahead. The stone heart, the heart-root nexus, the ancient formation at the planet's geothermal core, sealed since the first Star Wars, accessible only through the passages beneath the royal wing, built not as a weapon in the traditional sense, built as a recorder, a memory archive, a structure that absorbed truth the way rock absorbs heat, slowly, completely, permanently, and a key. Zariva had written about the key, about the pendant, about the theory old predating written Zari history, that the Stoneheart's activation was tied not to bloodline or authority, but to something more fundamental, the capacity for unconditional bond, for love that was not transactional. The pendant will not warm to ambition. Zariva had written, it has been tried. Lords and generals and those who believe power was the same thing as care. It stays cold for them, but in the stories of the first families before the wars, it burned like a living thing in the hands of the ones who had simply chosen to stay. He read that twice. Then he sat in the dark for a while. They arrested him at 2300, not violently, correctly. 2 palace guards from Drev's personal detachment appeared at his door with a sealed order, and the professional courtesy of people who are doing something they expect to be resented. By order of Chancellor Drev, the first guard said, acting on emergency authority in the context of the current diplomatic crisis. I know what it says, Caden said. He was already standing, already dressed. He'd been waiting. Let's go. They walked him through the palace, not the main corridors, the secondary routes, the ones used for prisoner transport, designed to minimize public visibility. He was thinking about the file. He was thinking about Corman's notation. I know what the report says because I wrote it. He was thinking about a man who had come to Zara and stood on top of a grave he dug and had not yet decided whether to open it. He was thinking about Suri saying, Grandma said the stone heart obeys fathers. He was thinking about Raylan's voice when she'd said, I believe you. The holding chamber was in the lower east wing, clean, small, a window that showed the base of the moon willow in the azure garden. They left him there. He sat down. He waited. She came at midnight. Not Raylan, Suri. The door opened with the quiet of someone who had spent time learning which hinges didn't creak and at what angle. She slipped through the gap, Tizzy on her shoulder, silent, for once copper eyes tracking the corridor behind her. She had bribed the guard rotation 2 hours earlier with Caden would later discover a detailed written argument about why temporary access served the palace's long-term strategic interests. The guard had been so confused by the footnotes that he'd simply stepped aside. She crossed to Caden and pressed the journal into his hands without saying anything. Then she said, the passages beneath the spire, the ones Grandma writes about. I found the entrance. He looked at her. Behind the moon willow hatch, she said, the one we used during the attack. It doesn't just lead to the bunker. If you go the other direction, she paused. I already went. I went to the first junction. It's real. Suri, the fleet opens fire in 6 hours. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without performance. A child who had grown up in rooms where people talked around the actual problem and had decided at some point to simply name things. You have the pendant. You can activate the stone heart, and then you can show them. Show them what? The truth. She said it like it was obvious, like it was the only answer that had ever been available. That's what the stone heart does. Grandma wrote it. It doesn't destroy. It shows. It takes what it has recorded and it gives it to whoever needs to receive it. He sat with that. It would work on Cormine, she said. Wouldn't it? It would show him everything. Yes. He thought about Cormine, about what everything would mean for a man who had been running from everything for 14 months, about whether that was mercy or punishment or something that sat between the two in a place that didn't have a word yet. Suri, he leaned forward, put his hands on her shoulders. If this goes wrong, you came back from the attack. That was different. You always say things are different. She looked at him steadily. They never are. He stared at her for a moment. This child who had asked him on the third night, "Are you going to leave too?" Who had held a ceremonial dagger twice her size at a raider 3 times her height, who had read a hidden journal in archaic script and found a secret passage and come to a locked room at midnight because she had done the math and decided the math pointed here. Promise me you'll stay in the palace, he said. You seal yourself in the high chamber with the guard rotation. I trust Sergeant Orell, nobody else. And you don't come out until I or your mother gives the all clear, okay? I mean it. I know you mean it. That's why I'm agreeing. She paused. I'm not agreeing just to agree. I'm agreeing because it makes tactical sense. I know. Good. She stood up. Tizzy chittered once softly. She smoothed the creature's fur with one finger. Then she looked back at him from the door. Come back. Always, he said. She slipped back through the door. 20 minutes later, the door opened again. Vraylin, alone, no escort, in a plain robe, dark green, unadorned, the kind of thing she wore when she wasn't performing being an empress. Her hair was down. He'd never seen her hair down before. It fell past her shoulders in waves of platinum, the violet threads catching the low light differently than they did in the throne room. Less formal, more real. She looked at him for a moment. He looked at her. The council reconvenes at 4 o'clock, she said. Drev has the votes for formal surrender. I can delay the vote by 1 session, perhaps 2. A pause. That buys you approximately 4 hours. The passages beneath the spire, he said. She went still. Suri told me about the journal, he said, about the stone heart, about what it can do. He met her eyes. I need you to tell me if she's right. Vraylin was quiet for a long time. My mother believed she was right, she said. She spent 30 years believing it. She never had a bearer who could test it. She looked at the pendant against his shirt. The pendant warmed the moment it touched you. In recorded Zari history, in everything my mother found, that has happened exactly twice. When, once 300 years ago, a man named Eris Vel, a human-born scholar who had lived on Zara for decades and married into a Zari family. She paused. And once, according to legend at the founding, when the first family sealed the stone heart and asked it to remember them, Caden thought about warmth, about something old and vast waking up beneath the floor. The passage entrance, he said, behind the moon willow hatch, East Junction. She crossed to him, stopped close enough that he could see the small scar along her jaw that he'd never noticed before, the way her amber eyes had flecks of green deep in them that only showed up in low light. She reached out, placed her fingers briefly against his chest over the pendant. 1 heartbeat of contact. The stone heart was built by the first families to remember truth, she said quietly, not to punish, not to destroy, to hold, so that truth could not be buried or rewritten or made convenient by the people with power to do so. She lowered her hand. It has been waiting for someone it could trust with that. He said, and if I use it wrong, she said, then you would not have been able to hold the pendant. He looked at her, at the steadiness of her, the stillness that comes from a woman who has stood alone in the center of very large problems for a very long time and has not flinched yet. 4 hours, he said. 4 hours, she agreed. He moved toward the door. Caden, he stopped. Come back, she said. He turned to look at her, and there it was, under the composure, under the Empress, just a woman standing in a plain robe with her hair down, saying a thing she did not say easily to anyone. Always, he said, and meant it in a way that was about more than the stone heart and the fleet and the 6 hours on the clock. He went. The corridor outside was empty. The palace was quiet. The twin moons were high. The reconstruction scaffolding on the eastern wall cast long shadows across the courtyard. Caden walked quickly, head down, the pendant against his chest doing what it always did. 4 hours, one man, one truth, and somewhere beneath his feet, in the deep geothermal dark, something ancient waited with all the patience of stone. Part 3. Truth is the only weapon that heals. The passage beneath the moon willow was older than the palace above it. Caden knew that the moment he stepped into it, the walls were not built. They were shaped, smoothed by something other than tools. The stone curved in long organic arcs, like the inside of a living thing, like ribs, like the throat of something vast that had swallowed the earth and was still very slowly breathing. The air was different here, warmer, not temperature exactly, pressure, the feeling of being inside something that was paying attention. He moved fast. The pendant was doing something it hadn't done before, pulsing, slow and steady, like a second heartbeat running just slightly behind his own. He pressed his hand against his chest without thinking, felt it through the fabric, still warm, warmer than warm. The east junction was where Suri had said, a fork in the passage. One branch curved upward toward the bunker. The azure gardened the surface. The other went down. He went down. The heart-root nexus was not what he expected. He'd expected machinery, ancient technology, the visual language of a weapon angles and purpose, and the aesthetic of things built to do damage. What he found was a cathedral, vast, domed. The walls were natural stone threaded with crystal formations that caught the light and held it, sent it back in slow fractured waves. The floor was warm underfoot, warm the way living skin is warm. The ceiling was so high it was lost in dark, and at the center, the stone heart. Not a machine, not a device, a formation, crystal and mineral and something else, something that had no name in any language Caden knew. The size of a small house, irregular, organic. It pulsed with deep blue light in a rhythm so slow it took him a full minute to recognize it as a rhythm at all. One beat, long pause, another beat, like something sleeping that was very slowly waking up. He walked toward it. The pendant left his chest. He hadn't unclasped it. He hadn't touched it. It simply rose, lifted on nothing, floated at the end of its chain, pulling toward the stone heart like a compass needle finding north. He let it pull, followed it forward. 3 feet from the formation, the pendant stopped, hung there, waiting. He reached out and pressed his palm flat against the surface of the stone heart. It didn't hurt. He'd braced for pain, some kind of cost, because everything real has a cost, and this was very real and very old, and he was not the kind of man who expected things to be given without price. But it didn't hurt. It was more like opening, like a door he hadn't known was there swinging inward, and on the other side of the door was not darkness, but everything. Everything. Sirah 7. He saw it. He'd been there. He remembered it as a soldier remembers in fragments, the smell of burning, the noise, the vectors and positions, and the terrible arithmetic of who made it and who didn't. But this was not his memory. This was the Stoneheart's memory, complete, unedited, every moment of it from every angle at once, the way a place remembers, rather than the way a person remembers. A mother, green-skinned, running, 2 children, one in each arm. The convoy rode ahead of her, the gate in the distance. Open! She could make it. She was going to make it. And then the order, not a physical thing, but he felt it. Felt the moment the gate mechanism received the signal. Felt the 3 minutes it sat unprocessed, because the routing system was overloaded and no one had cleared the queue, felt the gate begin to close, felt her understand that it was closing. He felt that. He felt the sensation of a person who understands that the door they were running toward is not going to stay open. The recalculation, the desperation, the children in her arms heavier with every stride, and the gate closing 1 centimeter at a time. He didn't want to be inside that moment. He was inside it anyway, because that was what the stone heart did. It didn't show, it didn't display, it transferred. It put you in the truth until the truth was something you had lived rather than something you had been told. And then Piers, 26 years old, standing at a position near the perimeter wall, young enough that the uncertainty still showed in his face, the uncertainty of someone who has been trained to trust the chain of command and is currently watching the chain of command produce an outcome that doesn't make sense. He had a comm unit in his hand. He tried to reach his commanding officer 4 times. No response. He tried to reach the gate control twice. Busy signal. He watched the gate close from 50 meters away. He watched the mother reach it 30 seconds too late. He stood there with the common unit in his hand and understood something, not in words, just the understanding landing whole without language, the way the worst truths always arrive. He understood who had signed the delay order. He understood why. And he understood that this knowledge, this specific terrible knowledge, was something he would carry for the rest of his life. However long that was, it was not very long. The perimeter breach came 12 minutes later. A sector Piers was covering alone because the evacuation confusion had scattered the rotation. He held the position. That was what his training said. He held it. He was 26 years old. Caden felt the moment Piers Corman died, not as data, not as a fact in a report, as the sudden abrupt silence of a person who was present and then was not. Like a note cut off mid-phrase, he stood in the Stoneheart's memory and felt that silence, and then he understood why Cormine had come to Zara, not to silence Caden, not to protect his career, not to preserve the version of history that kept him functional. He had come because this was where it happened. This was the place, and some part of him, the part that was still a father, still the man who had taught Piers to ride a bike and watch the stars and trust the chain of command, had brought him here the way water finds the lowest point, helplessly, without strategy. He had come because he couldn't stay away, because the grave was here and he was the one who had dug it, and he didn't know how to live with that, but he couldn't stop circling it. Caden pulled his hand back from the stone heart. The vision stopped. The nexus was quiet. The slow blue pulse continued. 1 beat, long pause, another beat. He stood in the warmth and the quiet and thought about choices. He had options. He was clear about this. Option 1, use the stone heart as a weapon. The formation contained enough recorded truth to end Cormine's career, his freedom, his carefully constructed version of events, a targeted broadcast on Cormine's own frequency. The one he was using to carry his fleet-wide voice would deliver everything directly to every bridge, officer, every crew member, every diplomat, monitoring the situation. Undeniable, immediate. Corman would fall. The fleet would fall with him leaderless, without legal basis for action. Caden would be free. Option 2. Option 2 was harder. Option 2 was what he'd felt while he was inside Piers's last 12 minutes. Option 2 was the thing Suri would do if she were here, because Suri was 7 years old and still believed that the truth that healed was worth more than the truth that punished. Option 2 was showing Corman everything, not the edited version, not the version that made Caden innocent and Cormine guilty and the math clean. Everything, including Piers at the perimeter, including the comm unit in his hand, including the silence, including the truth that Piers Corman had died knowing exactly what his father had done and had held his position anyway, because that was what his father had raised him to do. That truth would not set Cormine free, but it would make him real. It would end the fiction that had let him run. It would put him back in the room with the thing he had done and make him stand there and see it without the distance of constructed narrative and redirected blame. That was not mercy exactly, but it was not punishment either. It was something more specific than both. It was the offer of a truth that could be lived with, barely painfully, with a cost that would not diminish, instead of a lie that required constant maintenance and produced in the end a fleet of warships outside a sovereign world and a war nobody could afford. Caden pressed his palm back against the stone heart. All of it, he said aloud, to the nexus, to the formation, to whatever ancient intelligence had been recording and waiting in the dark for a bearer who could be trusted with the question. Show him all of it. The stone heart answered, not loudly, not with the dramatic surge he'd half expected, just a deepening of the pulse, the blue light intensifying by degrees, the warmth rising through the floor, through his boots, through his legs, into his chest, where the pendant floated at the end of its chain. He felt the broadcast go out, felt it the way you feel sound through a floor when the source is below you, vibration more than sensation, the truth leaving the stone and moving upward through rock and soil and the foundations of the palace and the energy fields of the defensive grid and the upper atmosphere, finding Cormine's frequency, entering it. On the bridge of the flagship, Admiral Cormine was giving the 4-hour warning. His voice was even. His hands were steady. He had done this before, delivered ultimatums, authorized engagements, signed orders with the flatness of command authority. He knew how to be the person in the room who didn't flinch. He had been practicing not flinching for 14 months. And then he stopped speaking mid-sentence. His second-in-command looked up from her station. Corman was standing very still. His hand, steady a moment ago, had gone to his temples. Not dramatically. The gesture of a man suddenly managing something interior, something arriving without warning in a place where he had kept the doors locked. His second said, Admiral. He didn't answer. He was somewhere else. He was at Cyrus 7. He was standing at the perimeter wall with a comm unit in his hand. He was feeling the gate close from 50 meters away. He was watching a mother understand she wasn't going to make it. He was understanding in the direct, unmediated language of lived experience rather than the mediated language of command reports exactly what his signature had produced. And then he was in the last 12 minutes, not watching, being. His second-in-command watched Admiral Cormine, the man she had served under for 11 years, the man she had seen dress down admirals and face down courts-martial and walk through every professional crisis she could document with the same iron composure, begin to cry, not dramatically, not with any of the signals that precede performed emotion, just the sudden presence of tears, and beneath the tears, a sound, low, private, the sound of a man who has been holding something for 14 months and has just had it taken from his hands, not by force, but by truth. Peers, he said, to no one, to the air, to the sun he had lost, in a place he had chosen not to see clearly until this moment. I'm sorry, he said. I'm so sorry. The bridge was completely silent. Every officer at every station was experiencing some version of the same thing. Not as intensely as Corman, the broadcast was centered on him. The Stoneheart had found its primary target, but enough to feel the edges of Syra 7, enough to understand what they had been pointed at Zara to protect. Not justice, a lie. The second-in-command looked at her weapons panel, at the targeting solutions locked onto Zara's defense grid. She powered them down. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for the order. She powered them down because the alternative was unthinkable, and she had just in the span of 90 seconds understood exactly how things become unthinkable. One by one across all 7 ships, weapons went offline. Vraylin heard it happen from the war room, not the broadcast itself. The Stoneheart's transmission was tuned to Corman's frequency, not the palace speakers, but she heard the fleet's defensive grid signatures change on the tactical display. 7 markers, all of them shifting from active to dormant in the span of 4 minutes. She stood at the display and watched it happen. Drev was in the room. He'd arrived for the 0400 session. He stood behind her and watched the same display with an expression cycling through several things at once: surprise calculation, the look of a man watching the chessboard reorganize itself in a way he hadn't anticipated. "That's not possible," he said. "And yet," Vreeland said. The comm panel crackled. Corman's voice. Different now. The command tone stripped away completely. What was underneath it was not weakness. It was something harder than command authority. The sound of a man who has stopped performing and started existing. "Zeri Dominion, this is Admiral Corman." A pause, long enough to be real. "We are standing down. All weapons offline. All boarding protocols canceled." Another pause. "I am requesting, not demanding, requesting the opportunity to submit to an independent tribunal. Coalition and Zari joint oversight." His voice caught, steadied. "The charges against Sergeant Voss are fabricated. The record of Syra 7 has been falsified. I am prepared to provide full documentation of my role in both." A silence. Then, "I am sorry for what was done, for what I failed to see." The comm went quiet. Vreeland looked at the display for a long moment. Then she turned to Drev. He was very still. The calculation in his face had reached its conclusion, and whatever the conclusion was, he didn't seem to like it. "Chancellor Drev," she said, quietly, "you will come with me." Caden felt the stone heart release him. Gentle, the way sleep releases a person, not cutting off, but receding. The warmth pulled back by degrees. The pendant drifted back to his chest and settled there cool, now for the first time since she'd placed it in his hand. He stood in the nexus and breathed. The blue pulse had slowed, deeper now, slower, the rhythm of something that has done the work it was built to do and is resting in the peace of completion. He put his hand flat against the stone one more time, not to activate it, not to request anything, just to say something without words to something that had been holding truth alone in the dark for a very long time. Then he turned and went back up. The palace was different when he surfaced, not structurally. The reconstruction scaffolding was still there. The guards were at their stations. The twin moons were 2 hours from setting, but the quality of the air had changed. The way air changes after a storm has passed, not calm exactly, more like resolved. The held breath of a place that has been waiting for a thing to happen and has just felt it happen. He came up through the moon willow hatch into the azure garden. The sky above Zara was beginning to do the thing it did before dawn, not lightning yet, but shifting in quality. The dark becoming less absolute, the stars at the horizon softening. He stood in the garden and pressed his hand to his chest. The pendant was still there, cool now, but there, still. He closed his eyes. He thought it's done, and then he heard running footsteps, small footsteps, fast. The sound of someone who has been waiting in the high chamber with Sergeant Orell for approximately as long as they can stand it and has made a tactical decision about the definition of all clear. He opened his eyes. Suri hit him at full speed, both arms around his neck, full body weight. The way she'd done it the first time and every time since, without restraint, without checking whether he was ready, because she had decided long ago that he was always ready, and she was usually right. He caught her. Of course he caught her. "You came back," she said into his shoulder. "Told you I would. You were gone for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I know. I timed it." She pulled back enough to look at his face, her silver eyes scanning him with the methodical attention she applied to everything, looking for damage, finding very little, deciding this was acceptable. The fleet standing down. Corman surrendered, requesting tribunal. She processed this, nodded once, the nod of someone receiving data that confirms a hypothesis they had considered likely. "I knew it would work," she said. "You didn't know. I was very confident." "That's different from knowing." "Only technically." She settled back against his shoulder. Tizzy poked its head from her pocket and chittered, once examining Caden with the copper-eyed thoroughness of a creature conducting its own assessment. Then it chittered again, apparently satisfied, and disappeared back into the pocket. Suri said, "Mom's in the throne room." He went still. "She has Drev," Suri said. The palace guards found the communication logs, the ones between Drev and Corman, about the gate. A pause. About Dad. About Aiden. Caden held Suri a little tighter. "She's okay," Suri said, with the precision of someone who knows the difference between okay and fine and is being careful about which word to use. She's doing the thing where she goes very still and manages everything." A pause. "She needs someone to stand next to her." He set Suri down, looked at her. "High chamber," he said. "Sergeant Orell, you just came back. 20 minutes, then I'll come back again." She considered this, the logic of it, the arithmetic of needs and where he was most necessary at any given moment. She was very good at that arithmetic, always had been. "Okay," she said, and meant it, not performing agreement, giving it. He ruffled her hair. She let him. The throne room was quiet. Vreeland stood at the center of it, alone. Drev had been taken to holding by the palace guard 20 minutes ago. The nobles who had witnessed the arrest had dispersed in the careful way of people recalibrating their political positions in real time. The room was empty of everyone except her. She was looking at the far wall, at the portrait of Aiden. Caden crossed the threshold. She heard him. He knew she heard him. She heard everything. She was one of those people, but she didn't turn. He crossed to stand beside her, looked at the portrait. Aiden, young, laughing at something outside the frame. The laugh a painter captures when the subject doesn't know they're being painted, yet unselfconscious, real. Caden looked at him for a long time. "He looks like someone who would have been good at this," he said finally. Vreeland said he was. "I'm sorry," Caden said, "for what was done to him." She was quiet. "The tribunal will investigate," he said. "Cormine's documentation, if it's as complete as he says, it'll cover Aiden's shuttle, the logs, the authorization chain. I know. It won't," he stopped, started again. "It won't give him back." "No," she said, flat, not cruel, just the flatness of a woman stating a fact. She has had 4 years to finish grieving and is still in the private arithmetic of loss, not finished. He stood beside her, said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say that would be more honest than just standing there. After a while she turned, not away, toward. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the holding chamber, without the diplomat's distance, without the empress's composure, the face underneath both, the one that had been there since the night after the Ashbourne attack, in the private audience room, when she'd placed her fingers briefly against his chest. "The stone heart released you," she said. "Yes, that means it believed the task was complete." "I think so. It has not released a bearer in 300 years. She held his gaze. "The last bearer was given a place in Zari history that people debate in academic contexts for generations." He said, "I'd rather not be an academic debate." Something moved through her face, very quickly, gone almost before it arrived, but he caught it. A smile, barely, the kind that happens when something unexpected is also exactly right. "What do you want?" she asked, and it was a real question, not rhetorical, not diplomatic, just the actual question. What does this man want? Now that the crisis is over and the fleet is standing down and the pendant is cool and the stone heart is at rest. He thought about it. Honestly, he said, "Breakfast," in the small room, the one with the window over the garden. A pause. "With Suri, who has been in the high chamber for 3 hours and is definitely not going to wait much longer, no matter what she promised Sergeant Orell. Another moment, longer. The smile came back, less quickly this time. Stayed. And after breakfast," she said. He looked at her. "I'd like to stay," he said. Simple, the same word he'd used in the throne room 8 months ago when she'd asked him to explain himself, and he'd said, "I just stayed." Same word, different weight. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Good." One word, but the way she said it. They arrested Drev formally at 6 o'clock. The communication logs were extensive. His contact with Cormine predated the fleet's arrival by 3 weeks, going back, it turned out, to the extension of Cormine's diplomatic visit, which Drev had facilitated, which Drev had manufactured a bureaucratic reason to approve. The plan had been simple. The crisis would force Vreeland into a political dependency, new alliances, new arrangements, with Drev as the architect of the solution. The plan had not accounted for Suri reading archaic script. The plan had not accounted for a guard who knew the service corridors. The plan had not accounted for a pendant that recognized something in a man that couldn't be manufactured or performed. Drev in the holding chamber was told this. He was told it by Sergeant Orell, who had a gift for delivering information without editorial. He sat with it for a long time. Then he said, "I underestimated the girl." Orell said, "Most people do." The tribunal took 3 months. Corman testified for 11 days. He testified about Cyrus 7, about the orders, about the communications he'd intercepted regarding Aiden's shuttle, about the chain of people who had known and the chain of people who had chosen not to know. He testified without legal strategy, without the performance of managed accountability that passes for honesty in institutional settings. He testified because the Stoneheart had shown him peers, and after peers, there was nothing left in him that wanted to construct a version of events that would let him live easily. He was convicted of 13 counts. He received a sentence that the legal analysts described variously as appropriate and as lenient, and as the kind of result that happens when a court has to decide what to do with a man who is genuinely guilty and genuinely broken, and genuinely at the end of all of it, telling the truth. He asked in his final statement before sentencing to address the Zari Dominion directly. Vreeland permitted it. He said, "I took your prince, I took your peace. I took a young man who trusted me most of all, and I chose my inability to face what I had done over everything I told myself I stood for." He stopped, started again. "I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't think I've earned the right to ask for that. But I want you to know that what I saw, what the Stoneheart showed me, is something I'll carry until I die. Not as punishment, as truth, because I think truth, even the unbearable kind, is the only thing that actually changes anything." The chamber was silent. Then Vreeland said, "We receive your truth, Admiral Cormine. We cannot give you peace, but we can give you the knowledge that it was heard." He nodded. That was all. In the weeks after the tribunal concluded, the palace became something it had not been in years. Loud, not chaotic. Loud in the way of a place that has had its silence broken by something that should have been there all along. Suri's voice in the corridors, Tizzy's chitter echoing off the jade floor, the sound of Caden's boots on the reconstruction scaffolding as he helped with the rebuild, not because it was his job, because he was that kind of person, the kind who sees something that needs doing and does it without announcing the decision. Vreeland watched from the balcony. She watched often, less as surveillance, more as the pleasure of watching something go right, of watching her daughter run to someone at the end of the day with the full confidence of a child who has never been let down and does not expect to start being let down today. She understood that pleasure now. She had been careful about it for a long time. She was less careful now. The evening after the tribunal concluded, Caden found her in the azure garden, not at the moon willow. She was standing near the east wall, looking at the vine that had grown back over the section repaired after the Ashbourne attack. The reconstruction crew had matched the stone almost perfectly. If you didn't know where to look, you couldn't find the seam. She heard him coming. She always heard him coming. "It grew back faster than I expected," she said. "The vine, the whole east section." She touched the new growth, pale green where the rest was deep, new and old growing together at the seam. The gardeners said the trauma accelerated it, something about the root system being stimulated. A pause. They said it happens sometimes, that damaged things given the right conditions grow back stronger at the break. He stood beside her, looked at the vine. Is that a metaphor? He said. It's horticulture. She looked at him, the amber eyes catching the last light. Although it can be both, he said. I should warn you, I'm going to be terrible at this. At whatever this is. He gestured between them, imprecisely. I make soup with too much salt. I tell Suri the wrong names for Earth constellations when I can't remember the right ones. I spent 8 months not noticing that you were watching us from the balcony. You noticed, she said. You simply didn't acknowledge it. He paused. Fair, he said. I was watching, she said, deliberately, because I needed to know if you were real. She looked back at the vine. People perform kindness. They perform patience. They perform being present because they want something from the performance. She paused. You weren't performing. I wasn't doing anything intentional. I know. She looked at him. That was how I knew. He stood with that for a moment. Then he said, you should know that Suri has already planned the next 6 weeks of astronomy lessons and has included evening sessions she considers non-negotiable. I know. She submitted a written schedule. She submitted a written with footnotes. He stared. She footnoted the rationale for each session's timing based on optimal constellation visibility. Raylan's expression was doing the thing it did when she was containing something. Containment almost complete. Almost. The footnotes cited 3 separate sources. She's 7. Yes. 7-year-olds don't footnote. Ours apparently does. Ours. The words sat between them in the garden air. Neither of them had planned it. She'd said it the way true things come out, not decided, not announced, just present. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them moved for a moment, and then she took one step, just one, closing the distance by half, close enough that he could see the green flecks in her amber eyes in the low light, close enough that the warmth between them was not just the warm air of the garden. She said, I have not let anyone stand beside me in 4 years. He said, I know. I am not. She stopped, started again. I will not be easy. I know. I will be stubborn about protocol in public settings, and you will find it infuriating. Probably. And I will expect you to tell me when I am wrong, which I will not enjoy, but which I will require, because I cannot trust advisors who tell me only what I want to hear. I can do that, he said. Ask Suri. I've been doing it for months. She told me. A pause. She said, and I am quoting directly, Caden doesn't let me get away with anything, and it's really annoying, and I trust him completely. He looked at the sky so she wouldn't see his face, blinked twice, managed himself. Okay, he said. Yes, she said. And that was the whole of it. Not a declaration, not a ceremony, just 2 people who had arrived at the same place by entirely different routes, standing in a garden where something had been hurt and was growing back stronger at the break, deciding that they were done, pretending the distance made sense. They found Suri under the moon willow, because of course she was there. Where else would she be? She was sitting with Tizzy in her lap and the journal open on her knee, Zariva's journal, which she had apparently decided was hers, and on the grounds that she had found it and translated most of it and named several of the key passages, and she looked up when they approached with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and is gratified but not surprised to see it arriving. She looked at Caden. She looked at Vraylin. She looked at the space between them, which was considerably less than it had been that morning. She nodded, with the gravity of a 7-year-old who has been conducting a patient long-term project and is now observing the successful outcome. Finally, she said. Caden sat down on her left. Vraylin, after a moment, sat on her right. Suri did not remark on this. She simply turned back to her book. Tizzy settled deeper into her lap. The twin moons were rising. Far below their feet, the stone heart pulsed in its slow, ancient rhythm. One beat, long pause, another. What star is that one? Suri said, not looking up from the book, pointing, at a bright point near the southern horizon. That's Aldebaran, Caden said, part of Taurus, the bull. Why is there a bull? People name things what they see. I don't see a bull. What do you see? She squinted at it for a moment. A person standing with their arms out, like they're waiting for someone to run to them. He looked at the star. He thought, yes, actually, that's exactly what it looks like. That's a better name, he said. Everything would be better if they'd let a 7-year-old name it. Almost certainly, Vraylin said quietly to the stars. In Zari, that star is called Aerith. It means the one who waits. Silence. Suri looked up. That's the same thing, she said. That's what I said in Zari. Yes, Vraylin said. It is. Suri looked at her, at Caden, back at her. Then she leaned her head against her mother's shoulder and put her feet into Caden's lap and closed her eyes. Tizzy chittered once, settled. The garden was quiet. The verdant spire rose behind them, lit from within by the soft glow of bioluminescent vines scarred in places and whole in others and alive throughout. The twin moons climbed. The stars held their positions the way stars do, indifferent to the small dramas of living things below them, and somehow, for that very reason, comforting. Below them all, deeper than the foundations, deeper than the stone heartbeat, slow, patient, complete. Vraylin's shoulder brushed his, not arranged, not intended, just the small, inevitable contact of two people sitting in the same space who have stopped holding themselves away from each other. He didn't move, she didn't move. Suri's breathing evened out into the rhythm of a child asleep. All pretense, abandoned, nothing left but the breathing and the trust that the people around her will still be there when she opens her eyes. He looked at the stars. He thought about home. Not Earth, not the shape of a planet, not a geography. The warmth of this moment, a sleeping child across his lap. The quiet presence of someone beside him who had chosen to be beside him. The smell of moon blossoms and night-blooming Zari vines, and the feeling of being somewhere that knew his name. Vraylin said very quietly to the air, rather than to him, I'm glad you sat down. He understood. Third night, Moon Willow, a child who'd asked if he was going to leave. So am I, he said. They sat under the twin moons and did not leave. He came as a guard. He stayed as a father. The galaxy learned the difference.